300 guests. One reception hall dressed in white orchids and gold light. A drone hovering somewhere above the crowd, hunting for the perfect shot. Chidi stood at the head table, tuxedo pressed, champagne glass raised, sweat gathering at his collar despite the air conditioning. Beside him, Kemi glowed in a gown that had cost more than most people's cars, laughing too loudly, touching her new husband's arm too often, as if proving something to a room full of people who already knew the story. Then the band stopped mid-song. Not a pause, a full stop, instrument by instrument, until the only sound left in the hall was the clink of a fork against a champagne flute somewhere near the back. Every head turned toward the entrance. 3 figures crossed the threshold together. A woman in a charcoal pantsuit led the way, her heels striking the marble floor with a rhythm too even to be casual. Behind her, a man carried a leather briefcase against his chest like a shield, and behind them both, walking without hurry, without a single wasted movement, came a woman the room had not expected to see again. Nneka. She wore no wedding colors, no smile for the cameras, just a quiet, deliberate calm that made the hair on more than one guest's arms stand up. Kemi's hand froze on Chidi's sleeve. Her mouth opened. No sound came out. Whatever speech she'd rehearsed for this day, it hadn't included this scene. Chidi's champagne glass tilted in his grip. A single drop slid down the side and fell unnoticed onto the white tablecloth. The drone kept filming. It didn't know yet that it was capturing the most watched footage of the year. Nneka stopped at the edge of the dance floor. She said nothing. Not yet. She simply let the silence stretch, let every guest in that room understand, without a single word, that something had just changed. Kemi's carefully painted smile had not fully collapsed. It hung there, frozen, somewhere between confusion and dread. The music did not resume. What Nneka came to say, and what it would cost the 2 people standing at that altar, is a story that started 9 years earlier, in a house that looked like it had everything. 9 years before that frozen moment on the dance floor, Acacia Avenue looked like proof that good things still happen to good people. Number 14 sat behind toll gates in Greenside, Lagos. Manicured lawns, a car in the driveway that caught the afternoon light just right, and a marriage everyone on the street pointed to when they wanted to believe in happy endings. Chidi ran a real estate consultancy. He wore linen shirts that never wrinkled and a smile that never seemed to slip, not even when things were falling apart behind it. And Nneka, if Greenside had crowned a queen, it would have been her. She ran her own pharmacy, built from nothing into a name people trusted with their family's health. Her jollof rice was the kind people asked about weeks later. Her loyalty was the kind people assumed was simply part of the furniture of the world, permanent, unshakable. 5 years into the marriage, Chidi's business nearly collapsed. A market crash wiped out 3 major deals in a single quarter. Rather than watch him drown, Nneka quietly emptied her personal savings, money she'd built through years of double shifts, and handed it over without asking him to repay a naira of it. She worked longer hours at the pharmacy to cover the gap it left in their household. She never once brought it up as leverage. The business recovered. Chidi rebuilt his client list, reopened his office, started closing deals again. But something in him did not recover alongside it. Gratitude, left too long without being spoken aloud, has a way of curdling. Chidi began to feel it not as a debt he owed his wife, but as a weight she had placed on him, proof in his mind that he needed rescuing, that his success wasn't fully his own. Her strength, which should have been something to lean on, became something he measured himself against and came up short. Her steadiness started to feel less like a home and more like a room with no exit. This is a pattern worth naming plainly, because it repeats in marriages far beyond Acacia Avenue. Resentment rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive as anger. It arrives disguised as boredom, as irritability over small things, as a growing hunger for anything that feels like it hasn't already been figured out. A partner who has only ever been given loyalty can start to crave the thrill of something unearned, not because the loyalty wasn't enough, but because it no longer felt like something he had to work for. Nneka noticed none of this. Why would she? She was busy running a business, holding a household together, and trusting the one thing she had never had reason to question. She had no idea a woman she'd known for 12 years was about to walk through her front door with a laugh Nneka loved, and a hunger of her own that had nothing to do with friendship. Kemi had been Nneka's best friend since university. 12 years of shared history, a cramped youth service apartment, late-night conversations after failed relationships, the kind of loyalty that survives family funerals and career setbacks because it's been tested by both. When Nneka was grounded, Kemi lived for momentum. She'd built a career as a freelance event planner, chasing the adrenaline of last-minute logistics and glittering guest lists. She was magnetic in the way people are when they've learned charm can substitute for depth, flamboyant, quick to drama, the kind of friend who made every gathering feel more alive the moment she walked in. Nneka had never questioned that friendship. Why would she? Kemi had been there for every hard year. That kind of history isn't supposed to be the thing that ends you. The opening came disguised as ordinary. Chidi was launching a luxury division of his real estate business, his biggest event yet, the kind of high-profile party that could redefine his client base. He needed someone sharp to run it. Nneka, buried under a sudden outbreak of malaria cases at her clinic, made the obvious suggestion, let Kemi handle it. She'd planned dozens of events like this. It was practical. It was modern. It made perfect sense. What Nneka didn't know, what she had no reason to suspect, was that Chidi had been quietly fascinated by Kemi's energy for over a year already. Not love, not yet. Just a low, persistent curiosity about a woman who made recklessness look effortless, who represented everything his careful, steady marriage did not. The planning meeting started late. They stayed late for reasons that had nothing to do with seating charts. Chidi, ever skilled at looking like something he wasn't, began painting himself as a man trapped in a marriage that had gone cold, misunderstood, unappreciated, quietly suffocating. Kemi, flattered that her best friend's accomplished husband would confide in her this way, began to believe she wasn't causing harm. She believed she was rescuing someone. Here's the part worth pausing on. Because it explains almost everything that follows. Betrayal rarely feels like betrayal from the inside. It feels like connection. When two people share a secret, especially one built on deception, the brain reads that secrecy as intimacy, a shortcut to closeness that skips the years it normally takes to earn. Psychologists sometimes call it conspiracy intimacy. It isn't love. It's the thrill of getting away with something mistaken for the real thing. Kemi didn't see herself as someone capable of this. Neither did Chidi, if he's honest. But by the time either of them noticed what they'd built, it was already too late to call it anything but what it was. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that it never occurred to you to watch for the signs? That's where Nneka stood for the better part of a year. The affair didn't announce itself with a single dramatic moment. It built in fragments. A text answered too quickly. A late arrival explained away with a tired shrug. A new attentiveness toward his appearance that Nneka mistook for a man simply feeling good about his rebounding business. She had no reason to look closer. Her best friend and her husband occupying the same room had never once felt like a threat. By the time the launch party happened, Chidi and Kemi were no longer meeting to discuss floral arrangements. They met to feed something else entirely, a shared secret that had become its own kind of addiction. Every stolen hour together carried the electric charge of getting away with something forbidden, and neither of them stopped to ask whether that charge was love or simply adrenaline wearing love's clothing. Ask yourself honestly, has a friendship in your own life ever shifted in a direction you didn't see coming until it was already too late to stop it? It happens more often than people admit, and it rarely looks the way we expect betrayal to look. It looks ordinary. It looks like two people who already trust each other, finding one more thing to share. The core of what was happening here deserves to be named directly, because it is the engine driving everything that follows in this story. Chidi was not simply falling for Kemi. He was constructing a narrative, a version of his marriage where he was the victim, where leaving would be justified, where whatever came next could be framed as rescue rather than betrayal. He needed Kemi to believe that story as much as he needed to believe it himself. Kemi, for her part, wanted to believe it too. Believing it meant she wasn't the woman destroying her best friend's marriage. She was simply a woman who'd fallen for someone unhappy, someone who deserved better than what he had. Neither of them asked the obvious question: better than a woman who had emptied her savings to save his business, worked double shifts without complaint, and never once asked for anything in return? They didn't ask, because asking would have meant confronting what they were actually doing. And so the affair deepened, insulated by its own justification, each stolen meeting reinforcing the story that made it feel less like a crime and more like fate. What neither of them understood yet, what the coming months would prove in devastating detail, was that Chidi wasn't only building a new relationship. He was quietly, methodically, building an exit strategy. And that exit strategy would turn out to be far more calculated and far more damaging than either of them had the stomach to admit, even to themselves. Here's the part of this story people find hardest to believe. The affair was never the real crime. The real crime was what Chidi did with the calculator and 8 months of patience. He knew the law. If he simply filed for divorce, Nneka would be entitled to half of everything, including the business she had personally kept alive with her own savings. So instead of walking away cleanly, Chidi began a process financial investigators call asset stripping, quietly moving marital wealth out of reach before anyone knows to go looking for it. Over 8 months, he siphoned funds from their joint accounts in amounts small enough not to trigger obvious alarm. He registered shell companies using forged documents and a manufactured identity, then funneled liquid assets into those accounts, where they'd be invisible to any court reviewing marital property. He took out multiple high-interest personal loans against the equity in the Acacia Avenue house, forging Nneka's signature on every document, a practiced hand that had clearly done this before. He went further still. 2 of their investment properties were sold to buyers who didn't actually exist, shell companies he controlled, purchasing at drastically undervalued prices, effectively hiding real assets behind fake transactions. This is worth pausing on because the tactic isn't rare. Financial infidelity, hiding money, debt, or major decisions from a spouse, shows up in a significant share of divorces, and asset concealment like this is one of its more calculated forms. If you manage joint finances with a partner, the practical takeaway is simple: know your full financial picture. Review statements together, know what accounts exist, what's owed, and what's owned. Silence around money isn't neutral. It's often the first sign that something else is being hidden too. To keep Nneka distracted while he worked, Chidi leaned on a manipulation tactic psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. 1 week he'd be cold, critical of her cooking, dismissive of her appearance, distant for no explained reason. The next he'd arrive with the cheap bouquet and a tearful apology, blaming work stress. This isn't random cruelty. It's a documented pattern favored by both fraudsters and emotional abusers. Because unpredictability keeps a victim anchored to hope rather than suspicion. It keeps her questioning her own read of the situation instead of questioning him. Kemi, meanwhile, had become an unwitting accomplice. Chidi told her he was protecting his assets from a vindictive wife, a framing that let her participate without confronting what she was actually doing. She helped move physical documents between properties, carrying forged deeds and falsified tax filings without realizing what they were. In her mind, she was supporting a man being wronged. In the eyes of the law, she was building a case against herself as an accessory to fraud. And here's the detail that matters most because it shows something true about people who build their lives on deception. Chidi believed he was executing something brilliant. In reality, he was leaving a trail wide enough for anyone with basic financial training to follow. He registered one of his shell companies using his own personal email address, adding only the numbers 777 to his usual handle, a decision so careless it barely qualifies as concealment. People who build entire double lives on confidence rarely stop to notice how thin that confidence actually is. Arrogance, more often than intelligence, is what eventually gets people like Chidi caught. None of this had surfaced yet. Nneka still believed she was simply working through a rough patch in her marriage. She had no idea her signature had been forged 4 times, or that the home she'd helped build now carried debt she'd never agreed to. That discovery was still weeks away, and when it came, it wouldn't come from Chidi at all. The explosion happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Nneka came home early, expecting a quiet dinner after a long shift. Instead, she found half the closets emptied and a manila folder sitting alone on the kitchen island, placed there with the same deliberate care Chidi used to place contracts in front of clients. Inside, a crudely drafted letter of separation, a list of demands, and bank statements showing their joint savings account drained to almost nothing. He wasn't just leaving her. He was leaving her with the debt he'd built in secret. Before she could process any of it, her phone rang. Not Chidi's name on the screen, Kemi's. "I'm so sorry, Nneka," the voice trembled. Whether from guilt or from the drama of the moment, it was impossible to tell. "Chidi and I are in love. He's been so unhappy. I didn't want it to happen like this, but you have to understand, he chose me." Nneka didn't scream, she didn't cry. What settled over her instead was a stillness that felt almost outside her own body, the kind of calm the nervous system produces when trauma arrives too fast and too large to process in real time. It's a documented response. When the brain encounters something overwhelming, it can shut down emotional receptors briefly, as a form of protection, buying the mind time before the full weight lands. She set the phone down on the counter without another word, walked to the bedroom, locked the door, sat in the dark for 6 hours. By morning, something in her had shifted. Nneka was a woman of science, a pharmacist who built her career on precision, on evidence, on refusing to guess when facts were available. Grief would come. It would come in waves for months. But that morning, she made a decision that would define everything that followed. She stopped crying long enough to start collecting evidence. She didn't confront Chidi. She didn't post about it, didn't call Kemi back, didn't give either of them the reaction they might have expected, and in some corner of their guilt might have even wanted, because a scene would have let them cast her as unstable and themselves as the reasonable ones. Instead, she went to work. She called a forensic accountant named Udo, whose reputation for untangling exactly this kind of financial deception preceded him. She retained a lawyer named Folake, sharp, unsentimental, the kind of advocate who treats a case like a puzzle rather than a tragedy. Chidi had spent 9 years building an image of Nneka as someone who wouldn't fight back. Soft, trusting, too consumed by her pharmacy and her routines to notice what was happening around her. He had projected his own shallowness onto her for so long that he genuinely believed it. He assumed a woman who spent her days dispensing medication and balancing ledgers wouldn't know how to trace a financial trail back to its source. He was about to learn how wrong that assumption was, though it would take months for the full cost of that mistake to reach him. Udo arrived at the house 3 weeks later, carrying a folder thicker than anyone expected a forensic accountant's first report to be. He laid it on the same kitchen island where Chidi had once left his manila envelope of lies, a detail Nneka noticed and said nothing about. "It's worse than we thought," Udo said, adjusting his glasses. "He didn't just drain the joint account. He forged your signature on a second mortgage against this house, and the shell companies," he tapped the folder, "he registered them using his mother's maiden name and his childhood pet's name as the account passwords. The man left a trail a first-year auditor could follow." Nneka absorbed this without flinching. Somewhere in the 6 months since the manila folder, she had learned to receive devastating information the way she once received a difficult diagnosis at the pharmacy counter. calmly, clinically, already thinking 3 steps ahead toward what came next.
What do? We wait. Wait for what? For him to finish what he started. Right now, everything he's built is sitting in stone testic. It's fraud, entering accounts and 4% in the fraud. The once move he remarries, though, yet he walk right into it.
It was, Nneka realized, a strategy built on patience rather than confrontation. The exact inverse of everything Chidi and Kemi assumed she was capable of. They had spent 9 years believing her strength was quiet because it was small. They were about to learn it was quiet because it didn't need to be loud. Here is the psychological pattern worth naming, because it explains why this strategy worked. People who deceive others consistently underestimate the people they deceive. It isn't arrogance alone. It's a kind of self-protective blindness. Admitting that Nneka might be capable of outmaneuvering him would have meant Chidi confronting exactly how much he'd betrayed. It was easier to keep believing she was too trusting, too busy, too soft to notice. That belief became his greatest vulnerability. 3 months after the separation letter, the engagement announcement came. It moved fast, faster than anyone expected, though anyone who understood the psychology of affairs built on secrecy wouldn't have been surprised. Relationships that begin in deception often rush toward legitimacy, hoping a wedding, a ring, a public commitment can retroactively wash away how the relationship actually started. Nneka read the announcement on her phone one evening, sitting on the same porch where, months later, she would explain everything to a stranger who needed to hear it. She felt something unexpected in that moment. Not heartbreak, not rage, but a strange, focused clarity. The wait was almost over, and she intended to be exactly where she needed to be when it ended. If you're following Nneka's patience so far, drop a comment telling me what you would have done differently. I read every single one, and stick around because what happens at that wedding is about to get a lot more public than anyone at that altar expects. Kemi threw herself into the wedding with the same energy she once brought to Chidi's launch party, except this time there was no client to please but herself. She wanted the biggest, most talked about society wedding Greenside had seen in years, not because she and Chidi had built something worth celebrating on that scale, but because a spectacle this size felt like proof. Proof to every friend who'd quietly distanced themselves. Proof to the community that had started whispering the moment the affair became public. Proof that what she and Chidi had wasn't a scandal but a love story worth this much noise. Chidi agreed to all of it, partly because refusing Kemi anything had become its own kind of exhausting battle he no longer had the energy to fight, but mostly because his hidden assets were still tied up in shell accounts he couldn't yet access without exposing them. And admitting that to Kemi would mean admitting the wealth she believed she was marrying into wasn't nearly as liquid as he'd let her think. So he took out more loans, real loans this time, under his real name, against a financial position that was already collapsing beneath the surface. Every deposit for the venue, the caterer, the imported flowers, dug him further into a hole he was building with his own hands, one extravagant choice at a time. Nneka watched from a careful distance. Folake had advised absolute silence, no confrontation, no public commentary, nothing that might make Chidi cautious. Let them borrow, Folake told her one evening over tea. Let them spend everything they can get there, hands on. Every naira they put into this wedding is a naira we'll be able to trace directly back to the marital estate he stole from you. There was a strange, quiet satisfaction Nneka found in this waiting period, not vindictive pleasure, but something closer to watching physics play out. She sometimes drove past the garden estate Kemi had chosen for the ceremony, watching workers assemble floral arches and string imported lighting through the trees. She wasn't plotting revenge. She was simply observing 2 people build something on a foundation she already knew was hollow. But there was a harder truth she had to sit with during those weeks, one that cut deeper than any of Chidi's financial betrayals. The wound Kemi had caused wasn't just about loyalty broken. It was about vulnerability weaponized. Nneka had once told Kemi, in the safety of a 12-year friendship, about her deepest fear, that she'd never feel like enough for the people she loved. Kemi had absorbed that fear, and later, without apparent hesitation, used a version of it against her. That's a pattern worth understanding clearly, because it extends well beyond this one story. The people closest to us often know exactly where we're most breakable. Trust doesn't just build intimacy, it hands someone a map. What they do with that map afterward is the truest measure of who they actually are. Even in the deepest friendships, protecting a portion of yourself isn't paranoia, it's self-preservation. The week before the wedding, the pressure Chidi had been outrunning for months finally caught up to him. The loans were coming due. The shell companies he'd built to hide his assets generated no actual revenue because he'd never learned to run a legitimate business, only to disguise a fraudulent one. The wealth Kemi believed she was marrying into existed mostly on paper, tangled in accounts he couldn't safely touch. He called her one evening, his voice tighter than he intended. "We need to scale back, just a little. The florist is charging more than we agreed." What followed wasn't a conversation. It was a screaming match that echoed through the empty halls of the rented apartment they shared. "You told me you were a wealthy man," Kemi shouted. "You said you had everything handled. If you can't give me the wedding you promised, maybe you should crawl back to your boring, frugal wife." The mention of Nneka landed like a blade. Chidi slammed the phone down without responding, sitting alone in the silence that followed, staring at a wall that offered no answers. Whatever intoxication had carried them through those late-night planning meetings a year earlier had long since evaporated. What remained wasn't love. It was two people bound together by guilt, by the sunk cost of everything they'd already destroyed to be together, and by a shared refusal to admit the thing they'd built wasn't worth what it had cost. Miles away on Acacia Avenue, Nneka was living through the opposite season entirely. The pharmacy was thriving, expanding into a second location. She'd picked up painting again, something she'd abandoned in her 20s to focus on her marriage and career, filling canvases with dark, vibrant color, broken bridges, rising suns, shapes that hadn't fully resolved themselves yet but were undeniably moving toward something. Udo finished his final report that same week. Every document was verified. Every shell company traced back to its source, every forged signature confirmed against notarized samples of Nneka's real handwriting. "We're ready," Folake told her, closing the folder with quiet finality. "The moment he tries to move funds after this wedding, we'll have him." Nneka nodded once. She wasn't nervous. She had spent months preparing for a single afternoon, and that afternoon had finally arrived. The morning of the wedding, Kemi stood in front of a mirror in a dressing room strung with fairy lights, watching a bridal attendant fasten the final buttons on a gown that had cost more than either of them earned in a month. She looked radiant. She looked, for one uninterrupted moment, like a woman who had gotten exactly what she wanted. Across the estate, Chidi adjusted his cufflinks with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. He'd received a call 2 days earlier from one of his shell company's registered agents, a routine compliance notice that meant nothing on its own, but combined with everything else pressing on him that week, it sat in his stomach like a stone he couldn't name. The ceremony itself passed the way ceremonies do when neither person at the altar is fully present for it. Vows were spoken. A ring was placed on a finger. Chidi kissed his bride in front of 200 guests, and if anyone noticed the kiss lacked warmth, they attributed it to nerves rather than truth. The reception began exactly as it had the last time this story visited this room, the band playing, champagne flowing, Chidi standing at the head table with sweat gathering at his collar for reasons that had nothing to do with the heat. And then, as before, the music stopped. This time the story doesn't cut away. Nneka crossed the marble floor at the same unhurried pace, Folake at her left, Udo at her right, his briefcase held against his chest like something he'd waited months to open. 200 guests turned to watch 3 people walk toward a wedding none of them had been invited to interrupt. Kemi's painted smile hung frozen on her face, the same expression it had worn when this scene first appeared. Except now, it kept moving. It cracked at the edges. Nneka. Chidi's voice came out smaller than he intended. This isn't. You shouldn't be here. I'm not here for you, Nneka said, her voice even, carrying easily through a silence so complete every syllable reached the back of the hall. I'm here for what belongs to me. Folake stepped forward, opening a leather folder with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this before. Mr. Chidi Okonkwo, on behalf of my client, I am formally serving notice of fraud proceedings related to the concealment of marital assets during your divorce filing, including forged signatures on multiple financial documents and the establishment of shell companies used to hide property from a court-mandated settlement. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Guests leaning toward each other, phones quietly rising from purses and jacket pockets. Udo opened his briefcase and produced a single document, holding it up just long enough for Chidi to recognize his own forged signature, magnified and highlighted in red. This is your handwriting, Udo said calmly. And this, he added, sliding a second page beside it, is hers. A forensic analyst confirmed the difference 3 weeks ago. Kemi's hand slid off Chidi's arm entirely now, her eyes moving between her new husband and the documents with a dawning horror that had nothing to do with performance. What is he talking about, Chidi? Chidi said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't confirm every word already spoken. Nneka looked at the woman who had once been her closest friend, and for the first time since that kitchen island 6 months earlier, allowed herself something close to an expression. Not triumph, something quieter. You should have asked where the money was actually coming from, she said, before you spent a naira of it. Then she turned and walked back out the way she'd come, leaving the wreckage behind her to unfold entirely on its own. The hall didn't return to celebration. It couldn't. Within minutes, hushed conversations replaced music entirely. Guests clustered in small groups, some already filming with their phones held low, trying to look discreet while capturing every second. Kemi's mother, seated near the front, had gone pale, clutching her clutch purse like it might steady her. Folake didn't leave immediately. Legal procedure required her to complete formal service, and she moved through it with the same unhurried precision she'd shown throughout, handing Chidi a second copy of the filing for his own records, confirming the date and time of service allowed for 2 witnesses standing nearby, closing her leather folder only once every requirement had been met. You'll be hearing from us again within the week, she told him, her tone entirely professional, entirely without malice. I'd recommend retaining counsel of your own before then. Chidi stood frozen at the head table, his rehearsed confidence from years of client meetings entirely absent. This was a version of himself he had never had to perform before, a man caught, in public, with no story left to spin. Kemi grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the edge of the dance floor, her voice a harsh whisper meant for him alone but carrying further than she realized. You told me the business was thriving. You told me the money was clean. Tell me right now, is any of what she just said true? He didn't answer with words. His silence answered for him. For those watching closely, and by now nearly everyone in the hall was watching closely, this moment offered something worth understanding beyond the drama of it. Financial fraud within a marriage rarely stays contained to one relationship. It moves with the person who commits it into whatever comes next, because the underlying behavior, deception as a first response to fear, doesn't disappear once new paperwork is signed. Kemi had believed she was marrying a stable, successful man. She was, in fact, marrying his pattern. Udo, still standing a few paces back, offered a brief, practical explanation to the small circle of guests near him, more out of habit than showmanship. In cases like this, courts typically treat concealed marital assets as still belonging to the marital estate, regardless of what name they're hidden under. Forged signatures alone can carry criminal charges, separate from the civil fraud claim. What you've just watched isn't the end of a story. It's the start of a legal process that will likely take months to resolve. A guest near the back, someone who would later post the clearest video of the entire scene, could be heard asking her companion in a low voice, "Wait, so is she getting the house back?" It was the same question moving through dozens of conversations across the hall, curiosity outpacing shock now that the initial jolt had passed. Chidi finally found words, though they came out weaker than he intended. "Nneka, please, can we talk about this privately?" But Nneka was already gone, out through the same doors she'd entered, Folake and Udo a step behind her, leaving Chidi to face 200 witnesses and a bride who was no longer looking at him with anything resembling love. Kemi sat down heavily in a nearby chair, still in her wedding gown, mascara beginning to streak despite her best effort to hold herself together. The dress that had felt like triumph 3 hours earlier now felt like a costume in a story that had turned into someone else's cautionary tale. Outside, in the parking area, Nneka paused beside Folake's car and allowed herself a single deep breath. The first full exhale she'd taken, she realized, in nearly 9 months. "It's done," Folake said quietly. "No," Nneka replied. "It's just starting. For them." She was right. What came next over the following weeks would prove far more damaging to Chidi and Kemi than anything that had happened inside that reception hall. The video appeared online within hours. By the next morning, it had been viewed hundreds of thousands of times, comment sections filling with strangers who had never met any of the 3 central figures but felt, somehow, entirely invested in what happened to each of them. Kemi's business, built on her reputation as Lagos's most sought-after event planner, collapsed within a week. 2 clients cancelled contracts outright, citing concerns about her judgment. Others simply stopped responding to calls. The same magnetic personality that had once filled every room she entered now made her instantly uncomfortably recognizable in every room she tried to enter afterward. Chidi and Kemi's marriage, barely a day old when it fractured in public, didn't survive the month. Kemi moved out of the apartment they'd shared, back into her mother's house, unable to look at her new husband without seeing the fraud investigators had confirmed, document by document, over the following weeks. "You used me," she told him during their final conversation, her voice hollow rather than angry now. "You let me believe I was marrying into something real." "You knew what we were doing wasn't right," Chidi said quietly. "You knew, and you did it anyway." Neither of them was entirely wrong. Neither of them had been entirely honest with each other or with themselves from the very beginning. What they'd built together had never been strong enough to survive contact with consequence, because it had never been built on anything sturdier than secrecy and shared guilt. Chidi's real estate consultancy, already weakened by the loans he'd taken out for the wedding, could not withstand the reputational damage that followed once the fraud allegations became public record. Clients who had once trusted him with major property transactions no longer wanted their names associated with his. Within 2 months, he'd shut the business down entirely. The criminal case moved forward separately from the divorce proceedings. Prosecutors reviewing Udio's forensic report found more than enough evidence to pursue charges, forgery in the fabricated signatures on loan documents and property transfers, and fraud in the deliberate concealment of marital assets from a legally binding settlement. Kemi was not charged criminally. Investigators found no evidence she had known the documents she carried between properties were forged, only that she had unknowingly assisted in moving them. But she carried a different kind of sentence, the public understanding, permanent and searchable, that she had built her happiness on a foundation she should have questioned far sooner than she did. She would later tell a mutual acquaintance, in a rare moment of honesty, that the hardest part wasn't losing the business or the marriage. It was realizing she had never actually loved Chidi. She had loved the idea of being chosen over someone as steady and accomplished as Nneka. That the entire foundation of what she'd fought for had never been about Chidi at all. By then, it was far too late for that realization to change anything. The court proceedings took 4 months to resolve. Chidi was found guilty on multiple counts of forgery and financial fraud. Given the scale of the concealment, the shell companies, the forged mortgage documents, the falsified property sales, the court imposed a custodial sentence alongside a full financial restitution order, requiring him to return the entire value of the assets he'd hidden, plus damages for the deception itself. The house on Acacia Avenue, along with the 2 investment properties he'd tried to bury behind fake buyers, was legally restored to Nneka in full. The court's ruling was unambiguous. Assets concealed through fraud during divorce proceedings remain part of the marital estate, regardless of the paperwork used to disguise them. For anyone navigating a similar situation, the practical lesson from this case is worth stating plainly. If you suspect a partner is hiding assets during a separation, document everything you can access. Joint account statements, property records, loan paperwork, before initiating formal proceedings. A qualified forensic accountant can often trace concealed funds even when they've been moved through shell companies, because financial trails, no matter how deliberately obscured, rarely disappear completely. Patience and documentation, more than confrontation, are usually what wins these cases. Kemi rebuilt slowly and quietly away from the public eye that had once made her business thrive and then made her unemployable within it. She relocated to Port Harcourt 18 months later, taking a corporate events coordinator position under her middle name rather than the one that had gone viral. Those who knew her before said she'd changed, softer somehow, more cautious. Someone who had learned the hard way that charisma without character eventually costs more than it earns. Nneka's pharmacy expanded to a 3rd location within the year, and she used part of the settlement to fund a small scholarship for young women pursuing pharmacy degrees, something she'd wanted to do for years but had never had the surplus, financially or emotionally, to make happen. She didn't remarry quickly. She didn't rush toward anything, in fact, a deliberate choice after 9 years of rushing toward a life that had turned out to be built on sand. Instead, she spent that first year rebuilding slowly, on her own terms, painting canvases that no longer needed to resolve into anything but exactly what they were. The story might have ended there, in the quiet satisfaction of a case closed and a woman rebuilt. But its most important moment was still ahead of her. Not in a courtroom and not in a reception hall, but on the same porch where she'd once read an engagement announcement and felt nothing but clarity. 2 years after the wedding that never should have happened, Nneka sat on her porch on a quiet Sunday evening, watching the sky shift toward dusk. A young woman from the neighborhood, barely 25, recently engaged, sat beside her, twisting a napkin between her fingers. She'd come to ask Nneka's advice about a fiancé who'd started behaving strangely, distant one week and desperately affectionate the next, and a best friend who seemed to be spending an unusual amount of time around him. "I don't want to be paranoid," the young woman said, "but something feels wrong, and I don't know if I'm imagining it." Nneka was quiet for a long moment before answering. "You're not imagining it. Trust that first instinct, the one that noticed before your mind found an excuse to talk you out of it." "How did you know? When it happened to you, I mean. How did you get through it without falling apart?" "I did fall apart," Nneka said, "for exactly one night. Then I decided falling apart wasn't going to get me my life back." She looked out at the darkening street. The hardest part wasn't losing him or losing her. It was learning that loyalty only means something when it's returned. I gave both of them 9 and 12 years of it. I got secrecy and theft in return. That's not a fair trade, and it never will be, no matter how much history sits underneath it. The young woman nodded slowly, absorbing this. "Here's what I'd want you to actually take from my situation," Nneka continued. "Revenge was never the goal, even though it might have looked that way from the outside. What I wanted was simply what belonged to me. My home, my name, my peace. The moment I stopped trying to make them feel what I felt and started focusing only on rebuilding what was mine, everything became clearer. That's the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge keeps you tied to the person who hurt you. Justice sets you free from them. The young woman left an hour later, with more clarity than she'd arrived with, though not yet the full peace Nneka had spent 2 years building for herself. Nneka sat alone on the porch a while longer, watching the last light disappear behind the rooftops of a street that had once watched her marriage collapse in full public view, and had since watched her rebuild something sturdier in its place. She had gotten her life back, not the one she'd planned, a better one, built on ground she'd tested herself. If you've ever had to rebuild trust, in yourself or in someone else, after a betrayal like this, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and I answer as many as I can. If this story held your attention the way I hoped it would, hit subscribe. There's another one waiting for you next week, and it might be even harder to look away from than this one.